Lieutenant Daniel Hayes crouched low, his breath shallow as he scanned the jagged horizon of Zarnus 4. The air shimmered under the glare of twin suns, their oppressive heat pressing down like a physical weight. In his hand, he clutched a blade, a simple, unadorned knife with a worn handle. It was a relic, a family heirloom passed down through generations, and now, his lifeline in this alien wilderness. The blade had seen better days, much like its owner, but it remained sharp enough to cut through flesh or foliage, as necessity demanded. The voice of Eve, the artificial intelligence embedded in his battered exosuit, broke the silence. Vital signs indicate dehydration is imminent. Might I suggest finding water before engaging in further heroics? Daniel suppressed a groan. Thanks for the update, Eve. I'll pencil that in between not dying and staying invisible. An ambitious itinerary, Eve quipped. Shall I mark your survival as tentative? He allowed himself a fleeting smile, though the situation was anything but humorous. 2 days had passed since the ambush, since the Xylan had descended on his team with ferocity and precision. The mission, a routine reconnaissance of the uncharted planet, had devolved into a massacre. The Xylan, towering predators with segmented exoskeletons and blade-like limbs, had made short work of his unit. Daniel was the last survivor, a man with a knife and a dwindling sense of hope, hunted by creatures that viewed him as prey. A rustle in the underbrush snapped his attention forward. He froze, every muscle coiled. The dense foliage swayed unnaturally, betraying movement. He tightened his grip on the knife, its weight both a comfort and a reminder of his vulnerability. The Xylan were close, too close. He slipped into the shadow of a massive, alien tree, its bark slick with a faintly luminescent sap. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the jungle alive with the distant roars and chirps of creatures he dared not investigate. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, a rhythmic counterpoint to the silence that followed the rustling. Whatever had disturbed the foliage was now still, watching, waiting. Eve, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Any movement on your sensors? Signal interference is significant, she replied, her tone almost apologetic. But if it's any consolation, I'm fairly certain you're being stalked. Not helping? A faint clicking sound echoed through the air, a language, or perhaps a form of echolocation. Daniel's pulse quickened. The Xylan communicated this way, their clicks and hisses a symphony of death. He adjusted his stance, every instinct screaming for him to run. But he knew better. Running was what they wanted. It was their game, their hunt. Instead, he knelt, pulling a strand of fibrous vine from the ground. He worked quickly, silently, fashioning a crude snare. The knife sliced through the vine with ease, its edge gleaming briefly in the dappled light. He anchored the trap to a low-hanging branch and backed away, his movements deliberate and controlled. The clicking grew louder, closer. Then he saw it, a shadow moving through the trees, its form angular and alien. A Xylan scout, its carapace reflecting the sun's light in iridescent flashes, crept forward on spindly legs. It paused, mandibles twitching as it tasted the air. Daniel's heart pounded as he pressed himself against the tree, knife poised. The scout stepped into the trap. The snare snapped tight, pulling the creature off balance. It screeched, a piercing sound that cut through the jungle. Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged, driving the knife into the Xylan's neck joint, the blade finding a weak point in its armor. The creature thrashed, its limbs flailing, but Daniel held firm, twisting the knife until the screeching ceased. He fell back, breathing hard, as the scout's body crumpled to the ground. The knife dripped with viscous, dark fluid, and his hands shook, whether from adrenaline or exhaustion. He couldn't tell. "Well done," Eve said, her tone flat but tinged with approval. "One down, several dozen to go." Daniel wiped the blade on his sleeve and rose, his eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of more Xylan. He knew the scout's death wouldn't go unnoticed. The rest of the pack would be coming, and they would be relentless. "Any bright ideas, Eve?" he asked, his voice edged with sarcasm. "Survive," she replied simply. "Though I'd recommend relocating. The patient man will not be far behind." Daniel frowned. "The what?" Xylan Cultural Archives refer to a figure known as the patient man, a warlord infamous for his calculated hunts. "If he's leading this pack, you're in more trouble than usual." "Fantastic," Daniel muttered. He retrieved the snare and moved deeper into the jungle, his steps careful and deliberate. The shadows seemed to close in around him, the trees towering like silent sentinels. Every sound, every movement, felt like a prelude to another attack. As he walked, his thoughts drifted to the knife in his hand. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a connection to his past, to his father, who had given it to him with a simple instruction. Asterisk, always keep your edge, son. Asterisk, it was a lesson he had taken to heart, in more ways than one. "Eve," he said, breaking the silence. "What's the probability I make it out of this alive?" "Low," she replied honestly. "But not impossible. Humans have a knack for defying odds." "Thanks for the pep talk." "Anytime." The jungle opened into a small clearing, the ground littered with strange, bioluminescent fungi. Daniel knelt and examined them, his knife slicing off a small piece. Eve scanned it and confirmed it as edible. He ate quickly, the taste bitter but tolerable, and moved on. The suns dipped lower, casting the jungle in an eerie twilight. Daniel knew nightfall would bring new dangers, predators he hadn't yet encountered. But for now, he kept moving, the knife in his hand a constant reminder of what it meant to be human, resourceful, resilient, and above all, determined to survive. Behind him, the jungle rustled again, but he didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The patient man stood at the edge of the clearing, his towering form outlined by the fading light of Xarnas IV's twin suns. He was a Xylan warlord of unparalleled precision, his segmented carapace gleaming with a sheen of ceremonial oils. Unlike the others of his kind, who reveled in chaotic bloodshed, he moved with calculated grace, each step deliberate, each action purposeful. His mandibles clicked softly as he surveyed the scene, the corpse of the scout, its neck cleanly pierced, the wound still glistening. The kill was impressive, efficient, resourceful. It spoke of a hunter with limited tools but sharp instincts. The human. He tilted his head, emitting a low-frequency hum. His entourage of lesser Xylan shifted uneasily at his side, their legs skittering against the ground. They were restless, eager for the hunt, but he raised a clawed hand to still them. "Patience," he said in the Xylan tongue, his voice a low, resonant vibration. "We are not chasing prey. We are testing an adversary." Deep in the jungle, Daniel Hayes moved through the dense underbrush, every sense attuned to his surroundings. He knew they were coming. Eve had confirmed it not minutes ago, her tone laced with the grim certainty of a machine that had calculated his odds and found them wanting. "You've got movement 200 meters back," she warned. "Multiple heat signatures. And I suspect one of them belongs to your patient man." Daniel smirked grimly. "I'm flattered he's taking the time." "Don't be. If the Xylan archives are accurate, he's probably composing an epitaph for you as we speak." The joke didn't land. Daniel was too focused on the terrain ahead. The jungle was alive with noise, the hum of insects, the distant calls of alien predators, the crunch of his boots against the fibrous ground. He needed a plan, something beyond running. The patient man wouldn't be rushed. He would take his time, observing, adapting. And Daniel knew he couldn't outlast him in a war of attrition. He crouched low near a shallow stream, the water gleaming faintly under the fading light. Pulling his knife free, he began shaping a series of crude spikes from fallen branches. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, his mind flashing back to survival training, to the lessons drilled into him during his years in the Corps. Adapt to the environment, his instructor had said. Use everything, waste nothing. That's the human way. As he worked, Eve interrupted. "One heat signature is deviating from the group." "Large." "It's him?" Daniel froze, his heart hammering. You're sure? Probability exceeds 90%. He's circling, assessing, hunting you personally. Perfect. The patient man watched from the shadows, his compound eyes unblinking as he observed Daniel's preparations. The human was clever, quick to adapt, but he was also predictable. Traps, improvised weapons, and guerrilla tactics. They were all hallmarks of a desperate survivor. Yet this human intrigued him. Few prey adapted so quickly. Fewer still possessed the tenacity to fight back against impossible odds. With a low click of approval, he moved silently through the jungle, keeping his distance, his every step calculated to avoid detection. He could have ordered his pack to swarm the clearing, to overwhelm the human with sheer numbers. But that would defeat the purpose. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a test of wills. Daniel finished setting his trap, a cluster of sharpened stakes concealed beneath a thin layer of foliage. It wasn't much, but it was something. Rising to his feet, he scanned the area, his knife in hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the jungle itself was conspiring against him. Movement, Eve whispered in his ear. He turned, his eyes locking onto the massive form of the patient man as the warlord stepped into the clearing. The Xylan was larger than the others, his carapace adorned with intricate patterns that glimmered in the dim light. He moved with deliberate slowness, his claws clicking softly against the ground. There was no rush, no urgency. The patient man exuded a calm, almost regal confidence, as though he already knew the outcome of this encounter. Daniel tightened his grip on the knife. "You've been following me?" The patient man tilted his head, his mandibles twitching. Then, to Daniel's surprise, he spoke, his voice guttural, but unmistakably clear. "You are persistent." Daniel blinked. "You speak English?" "I learn." The warlord's mandibles twitched into what might have been a smile. "You are resourceful. Different from others. Worthy of patience." "I'll take that as a compliment." "Survive," the patient man said simply. "If you can." With that, he raised one clawed hand, and the lesser Xylan emerged from the shadows, encircling the clearing. Daniel cursed under his breath. The patient man wouldn't engage directly, not yet. This was part of the test, part of the warlord's methodical approach. The Xylan charged, their movements swift and coordinated. Daniel reacted instinctively, slashing and stabbing with his knife, using the traps and terrain to his advantage. The jungle erupted into chaos, the sounds of combat blending with the screeches of dying aliens. One by one, the lesser Xylan fell, but the effort took its toll. Daniel's muscles burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His traps were spent, and the knife felt heavier in his hand. He turned to face the patient man, who stood unmoving, watching with an almost clinical detachment. "You're not going to finish this yourself, are you?" Daniel shouted, blood dripping from a gash on his arm. The patient man stepped forward, his claws glinting in the dim light. "You misunderstand. This is the beginning." Daniel raised his knife, his eyes locked onto the warlord. He knew he couldn't win in a direct fight, but he also knew he couldn't back down. The jungle fell silent as the two adversaries faced each other, the air thick with tension. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the patient man lunged, his claws arcing through the air. Daniel dodged, barely avoiding the strike, and countered with a slash of his own. The warlord blocked the attack with ease, his movements fluid and precise. It was clear he was toying with Daniel, testing his limits. "Eve," Daniel muttered, his voice strained. "Any bright ideas?" "Survive," she said, echoing the warlord's earlier words. "Helpful?" The patient man struck again, his claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. Daniel parried with the knife, the impact jarring his arm. He could feel his strength waning, but he refused to give in. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a battle of philosophies, human ingenuity and determination against the cold, calculated precision of a superior predator. And Daniel Hayes wasn't about to lose. The jungle swallowed Daniel Hayes as he fled into its depths, the knife gripped tightly in his trembling hand. His breaths were labored, his body battered, but his mind raced. The patient man was relentless, a predator who stalked not with haste, but with precision. Daniel could almost feel the warlord's calm gaze tracking his every move. He slid down a rocky incline, landing in a shallow ravine overgrown with bioluminescent moss. The dim glow bathed the area in an otherworldly light, enough for him to make out the jagged walls and the faint outline of a cavern. He needed time to think, time to plan, time to survive. "Eve," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "How much time before he catches up?" "Estimation. Less than an hour," the AI replied. His movements suggest deliberate pacing. "He's giving you room to struggle." Daniel grimaced. "He's not hunting me. He's studying me." "Indeed," Eve said. "You're a puzzle to him, a rare opportunity to test his philosophy. He could kill you anytime, but he doesn't want just victory. He wants to prove superiority." Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow and took stock of his surroundings. The cavern wasn't deep, but its entrance offered a defensible position. He examined the moss clinging to the walls and the scattered debris around him. An idea began to form, desperate but feasible. He knelt and began working, his knife flashing as it sliced through vines and stripped bark. He scavenged shards of stone, weaving them into crude traps designed to maim, slow, or distract. His hands moved with practiced precision, the motions instinctual. The knife, battered but still sharp, became an extension of his will, a tool of both survival and defiance. "Are you sure this plan is sound?" Eve asked after a moment of silence. "It's not a plan," Daniel muttered, binding a vine to a sharpened stake. "It's a last stand." The patient man arrived at the ravine with the measured stride of a monarch surveying his domain. He paused at the edge, his compound eyes scanning the terrain below. The tracks were clear, human footprints leading into the cavern. A trap, no doubt. He tilted his head, emitting a low hum of amusement. Cleverness was a trait he admired, even in prey. Descending the rocky slope, he moved with deliberate care, his claws clicking softly against the stone. Inside the cavern, Daniel waited, crouched behind a boulder. His traps were set, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The knife in his hand felt heavier than before, its blade dulled by constant use. But it was still sharp enough, he would make sure of that. The patient man stepped into the cavern, his silhouette a looming shadow against the moss's pale glow. He paused, his mandibles twitching as he took in the scene. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut vines and disturbed earth. A trap, indeed. With a slow, deliberate motion, he triggered the first snare. A vine snapped, releasing a makeshift spear that hurtled toward him. He caught it mid-flight, the crude weapon snapping in his claws. His mandibles clicked, a sound that might have been laughter. Daniel struck from the shadows, his knife aimed for the warlord's neck joint. The patient man twisted, deflecting the blow with his armored forearm. The force of the impact sent Daniel sprawling, but he rolled to his feet, knife at the ready. "You are persistent," the warlord said, his guttural voice echoing in the cavern. "It's a human thing," Daniel replied, circling him. "We don't quit?" The patient man lunged, his claws slashing through the air. Daniel dodged, the narrow space of the cavern forcing him to move with precision. He slashed with his knife, the blade grazing the warlord's carapace, but failing to penetrate. The battle was brutal, a clash of brute strength against desperate ingenuity. Daniel used every tool at his disposal: traps, terrain, even the glowing moss, which he smeared on the warlord's eyes to blind him temporarily. But the patient man adapted quickly, countering each tactic with an efficiency that was almost machine-like. Daniel was tiring. His movements slowed, his strikes lacked force, but he refused to stop. The knife, his constant companion, flashed again and again, a blur of defiance against the warlord's relentless assault. Finally, the patient man struck, his claws slamming into Daniel's side and sending him crashing into the cavern wall. Pain lanced through his ribs as he struggled to stand, blood dripping from his wounds. The warlord approached, his gait calm and unhurried. "It is over," he said. "You have fought well, but humans always break." Daniel coughed, tasting blood. He glanced at the knife in his hand, its blade chipped and coated in alien ichor. "Maybe, but we also adapt." With a surge of strength, he triggered his final trap, a thin strand of vines stretched across the cavern floor. A cluster of jagged stones fell from above, striking the patient man and pinning him momentarily beneath their weight. Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged, driving the knife into the warlord's exposed neck joint with every ounce of strength he had left. The blade pierced deep, and the patient man let out a guttural hiss, his body convulsing as dark fluid spilled onto the cavern floor. The warlord's mandibles twitched as he stared at Daniel, his voice a rasping whisper. "You are remarkable." Daniel stepped back, breathing hard, as the patient man collapsed, his massive form going still. Eve's voice broke the silence. "Vital signs indicate you're about 10 minutes from passing out." Daniel laughed weakly, the sound bitter. "Noted." He limped out of the cavern, the knife still in his hand. The jungle stretched before him, its dangers undiminished, but he no longer felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The knife was battered, its edge dulled, but it had done its job. It was a testament to humanity's will to survive, to adapt, to fight even when the odds were insurmountable. As the twin suns began to rise, Daniel Hayes kept moving. Somewhere out there, a rescue beacon pulsed faintly, a promise of salvation. Until then, he had his knife, his wits, and the unshakable resolve of a man who refused to break.